So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the HSC Focus Day for Studies of Religion. At the outset of our morning today, I acknowledge with deep respect the Wongal people, the traditional custodians of this land, the land on which ancestors have walked from all time. We pause as a mark of respect in gratitude for their stewardship and as a sign of our commitment to walk the journey to reconciliation. And so, welcome to Religion and Belief Systems in Australia, the Religious Landscape. My name's Elizabeth Alderton and I'm the Acting Assistant Principal at St Ursula's at Kingsgrove, where I teach both 1 unit and 2 unit studies of religion. At our outset, can I ask for a show of hands? How many 2 unit students do I have in the room now? Okay, quite a few. I'll make a couple of comments as we go on about some of the connections that you can make and some of the things you need to be careful of in the difference between this and your Religion in Australia unit. Religion and non-religion, sorry. In addition, how many of you studied this unit in term 4 of year 11? Show of hands? Okay, most of you. Experience tells me that there is a phenomenon called year 11 brain, that it's somewhat different to HSC brain, and that sometimes you don't tend to remember what happened on the previous side of Christmas. So then if I asked you to show of hands, 10 fingers being I'm going to be 100% successful in this topic in my HSC, 0 fingers going really don't have a clue, rate yourself. Where are you on the scale? Oh, we've got a perfect 10 at the back. All right. Okay. All jokes aside, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very important exercise. Because in around about 4 weeks' time, actually 5 weeks today, if you're sitting the CSSA paper, you're going to be sitting your trial HSC in Studies of Religion. And you need to be able to back yourself. And if the answer is 3 or 4, then listen very carefully and work out what it is that you need to know for success in your HSC. So this topic, as you would be aware, has 2 strands. It has the religious expression in Australia strand. How is it and how did it get to be that way? It also has the Aboriginal spirituality strand. I'm not going to deal with the Aboriginal spirituality strand today. There is a workshop run by Julianne Manson and Lisa Buxton, and they're dealing explicitly with that content. So if you need a bit of help there, I've never heard Julianne speak, but Lisa is an absolute expert, so go along and hear them. So today I'm going to focus on the religious landscape in Australia. Literally what it is and how did it get to be that way. So we look at the numbers and things that influence the numbers. And then if we've got time, we'll move on to look at ecumenism and interfaith dialogue and the role of religious traditions in the process of reconciliation. So what are you asked to do with it? 10 itsy-bitsy multiple choice and 5 short marks in a 10 to 12 line answer, and only one of them. Kind of sounds pretty snacky. But if you're a 1 unit student, that 15 marks is 30% of your HSC. And it is the part where often students race through it in the exam and often they neglect it because it looks easy. I don't believe that it is. And every year we as teachers, I don't know whether you know this, but we as teachers get a breakdown of how our students perform across the HSC exam. And when I speak to my colleagues and when I examine my own students' results, This is the one where there is the greatest margin for error. And any time I've taught a student who's got 49 out of 50, it's been a multiple choice that's been to blame. So it's not as easy as it looks. So let's have a look at what the syllabus asks. 2 parts. It gives us the general outcomes for this topic. They're very general. A lot of them come back in with our depth studies. But have a look at the verbs. What you would be perhaps more familiar with are these, the learn to statements. What it is you're expected to be able to do by the end of your course. Outline, account for, describe, evaluate, examine. They sound perhaps a little easier. But the Board of Studies is unequivocal in its statement that you can be asked any of the verbs that relate to this topic. So when we put them next to each other with our lovely little outline and account for, and then describe, evaluate, examine on one side, we find that if we look at the general unit outcomes, we have things like analyse, synthesise. So what's to stop the board putting a stimulus on that's really, really hard that asks you to do that analysis? This is where you need to be very aware of the scope of this unit. So it's good to learn a whole lot of facts, but what you do with those facts, how you analyse them, how you explain them, how you assess and relate them, that's the key to success in this unit, as it is in all of your topics in SOR. So our syllabus says we outline the changing patterns of religious adherence using the census data, and we account for the religious landscape. And we account for it in those terms. The outline, well, I won't say it's easy. If you're not a maths brain, some students run 100 miles when you put numbers on the screen. But it's doable and it's manageable. When preparing for this unit, there are a few things that you really need to be aware of. You need to be aware of the time frame. In a lot of our textbooks, you will see census graphs that go back to 1901. Irrelevant. We're interested in what happened after 1945. So our first set of census data for that period is the 1947 census. But you also need to be aware of your time period, because the question may not ask you for the full post-World War II time period. It might ask you for this century. It might ask you for the period 1945 to 1981. It might ask you in the 20th century. So you need to be aware of your time frame. You also need to know your numbers. Hands up, what percentage of Australia's population is Christian in the 2011 census? Almost 62%, 61.7%. What about in 1947? Anybody want to have an educated guess?
40?
No, quite the other way. 88%, almost. It's 87.6%. Do you notice why time period is important? It's great for us to know the 2011 stats. But if we're asked to do trend data, we need to know where it starts, we need to know where it finishes, and we need to know what's happening in between. So we've got to have a fair idea of what's going on for the major religious traditions and the largest of the denominations within Christianity. We also need to know different ways of looking at the numbers, and I'm going to do that this morning, and the language of comparison. Biggest, smallest, fastest, slowest. What do those words mean when they're applied to this data? So this is going to look very familiar, yeah? Oh, Hope so. This is a representation of Christianity's data from 1947 across to 2011. If you're not real familiar with it, you need to become familiar with it. These slides will be made available to you on the CEO RE Online intranet, so you'll get these. This is simply the census data made into a PowerPoint slide in big numbers. But there are some interesting things going on. Let's have a look here at Uniting Church. Blank, 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 blank. Oh, 4.9 in 1981. What happened? It merged. It didn't merge with anybody. It got created. It got created by the merger of 3 different Christian denominations. And they were Congregational, Methodist, Presbyterian. Okay. And which one of those religious traditions actually also remained autonomous so that churches of that denomination continued to exist? Presbyterian. If you didn't know that, can I tell you that you need to? Because nowhere in the syllabus does it tell us that we need to know about the formation of the Uniting Church, except that this data here suggests that there's something going on. And I reckon every year for about the last 10 years there's been a multi-choice on it. So you need to know the year, which was 1977. You need to know the 3 Christian denominations, Presbyterian, Methodist and Congregational. And you need to know that Presbyterians also maintained some autonomy. That's important. What about our non-Christian religions in the census and our no religion? What do we see? I think this is actually a really important page for us as Australian citizens. Because when we hear the nonsense of some of our media and perhaps some of our neighbours and friends saying that we're being invaded by Muslims, perhaps that might put it in perspective. What percentage of Australia's population are Muslim? 2.2%. It's hardly an invasion. And I think that as good educated citizens, apart from an SOR exam, these stats keep a good perspective. A couple of other interesting things here, and we will come back to this. What was the fastest growing religion in 2011?
No religion.
No religion isn't a religion. Can't be the fastest growing. Hinduism was the fastest growing religion. And yet, if we look here, we have to wonder about that. We have to wonder how it is that that can be the case. And that's because we need to look both at absolute growth and relative growth. And we'll do that in a moment. The other one that interests me on here is non-religion. And don't fall into the trap. If you are asked for the fastest growing religion, non-religion isn't a religion. It's a category on the census, but it's not a religion. So we might be interested in the rather exponential growth in non-religion from a mere 0.3 back in 1947 all the way up to 22.3% of the population. And when you muse that perhaps the not adequately stated might also have some non-religion in it, it's a fairly large percentage. But why the change in the 70s? Up the back.
Because on the census there was an option to tick no religion, and that I think came in 1981. So then when that came in, people would tick in that instead of just going with the random religion.
Excellent. So the addition it was actually in the 1970s of the no religion category gave people the permission to tick no religion instead of being nominally Christian or nominally Orthodox or nominally Buddhist. No religion became a category. And then there are other ways of viewing the data. This one I think is fairly easy. 2011 census, we've just said that Christianity makes up 61%. So if we look at this, there's half. 61's just a bit bigger than half. Big blue blob. We could probably guess that that was a pie graph representing the percentages of the religious traditions in 2011. Would everybody agree? Also represents the growth of the non-religion category. But what about if you got this pie graph? Now, there's deliberately no labels on it, ladies and gentlemen, but it is the 2011 census data. And what it is Christianity taken as a whole. So if we looked at the total distribution of Christian affiliation, what we find is that our two largest groups are Catholic and Anglican. This is Christianity. And so I could then put up those labels for you, and you could concur by comparing them with the table data that in fact that's the correct answer. It's just a little trickier though, because we don't tend to see Christianity as a whole, or we don't tend to see religious traditions other than Christianity as a whole. There is no compulsion for the Board of Studies to give us what we expect. So it's really good for us to look a little more broadly. This is just another way of showing the data. A good comparison of the two most recent census. And it's also a good opportunity for us to think about some of those vocabulary words that describe this unit. If I were looking at that data, would I say that the pattern is similar or different? Overall, generalisation. It's similar. There is a bit of shuffling. Anglicanism has dropped below non-religion. But in general, Catholicism's at the top on both sides. The Christian religions are very similar in size. There's not a lot of difference. So if we're going to generalise, we could make a statement that the distribution of adherents has remained reasonably constant. That's a trend that we have observed in the data. Highest, lowest, all of those sort of words we need to be able to use because we're given 5 marks and about 12 lines. So we don't want to waste the first 4 lines cranking it up, thinking about what we're going to write. We need to be able to use the terminology so that the answer is explicit. So let's return to that outline word. What happened? Did it go up? Did it go down? Did it grow? Did it shrink? Is it large? Is it small? Which religion are we talking about? Is it Christianity or is it another religious tradition? Is it a denomination within Christianity? When did what we're talking about happen? Was it between the 1981 census and today, as we've seen the presence of the Uniting Church, because it didn't exist? It was formed in 1977. How much happened? Was it big? Was it small? Was it significant? Was it a minor change? Was it insignificant? Think about those words. And did it go up or down? And was it the fastest or the slowest? And how do we know? And that's what I want to deal with now, by having a little bit of a look at our non-Christian and no religion category between the 2006 census and the 2011 census. And the example that I want to use to start with is Buddhism. You can see here, in 2006, there were 418,000 Buddhists in Australia. That made up approximately 2.11% of the population, 2.11%. Had the number of Buddhists increased in 2011? 2006 it was 418, 2011 529,000. It's gone up. It is now 2.46% of the Australian population. But it has experienced a growth rate of 26%. How do I get that? It's as simple as saying, where was it in 2006? And in comparison to where it was in 2006, how big is it now? So, it's grown by just over 100,000, would you agree? And 100,000 as a percentage or a proportion of 418,000 is about a quarter, about 25%. And we now see that the growth up here is 26%. So that growth column shows us the rate of growth of each of those religions relative to where they were back in 2006. Hence, Buddhism, which we know is the fastest growing religious tradition, is still itty-bitty, teeny-weeny in the whole context of Australia. But look at the speed of its growth. Hinduism started with 148,100 adherents. In 2006, it almost doubled. In 2011, it was 275,000. So while it only makes up a mere 1.28% of Australia's population, while it is the third largest non-Christian religious tradition after Buddhism and Islam, it experienced the fastest growth rate of a whopping 86%. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is it a requirement to account for the source of that increase?
I think it is, but what we're doing at the moment is we're doing the account for. So this is the summary of the account for. Now we're going to have a look at, describe. Now we're going to have a look at the account for. And we can do the same thing with the Christian stats. And I put the Christian stats up there to show you that in fact the fastest growth in Christianity, the second fastest growth in Christianity is actually a negative growth. If a denomination has less people in it than it did the last time, its growth is negative. So if we look at that, we can see that the Anglican Church has experienced a small negative growth, a significant negative growth in the United Church, and interestingly enough, a significant growth in both the Baptist Church and the Pentecostal churches relative to what they were. And maybe now, when we go into the account for, we might be able to find reasons for that. So, over to you. Talk to the person next to you for 30 seconds and answer those questions. I think it's pretty amazing that I've really spent half of the lecture looking at the statistics, because I think that unless you're a maths brain, stats actually scare people, and they're not that scary when you break them open. And if you understand them and you can describe them, then you have a lot more chance of being able to account for why they are the way they are. So that's what we're going to move on to. We've done the description, we've done the figures, the trend language, the traditions and the denominations. Now we're going to go and have a look at some key factors. Our syllabus tells us that we must know about immigration, about secularism, about the growth of New Age religions or philosophies, and about denominational switching. And I've added my own two personal favourites, the abolition of the White Australia policy, which we'll get to in a minute, and the formation of the Uniting Church, which we've already looked at. So, first one, biggest one, sometimes the easiest one because it's actually really obvious, but we need to know the details, is the role of immigration. It has shaped the religious landscape more than any other single influence since 1945. Show of hands. How many of you have parents or grandparents who were born overseas, or you yourself were born overseas? So if I'd given this lecture 50 years ago, there wouldn't have been anybody in the theatre. Pretty much. In a class of 27 back at school, I have one student whose grandparents were born in Australia. So you are living proof of the impact of immigration on the religious landscape in Australia. What we need to be able to do when we do this is we need to be able to do three things. We need the time period. I have said to you, time is of absolute significance. You must know what time period you're talking about. You must be able to describe the trend. Put it into trend words: increase, decrease, rate of increase, rate of decrease if you can. And then you must be able to have the causes. You must be able to account for, because accounting for is absolutely crucial to this exercise. So the first page I've done for you, to the extent that I've shown a time period that I'm interested in, and I don't think you can make that any smaller. I think most of the teachers in here would agree 45 to 60 is a pretty reasonable time period. What is the trend? Well, if we go back to those census statistics, one of the biggest increases is the growth in Catholicism from 20% in the 1947 census to just over 24% in the 1961 census. That's a fairly significant increase. Why? Well, post-war immigration. European countries that were Catholic, Malta, Italy, those countries provided us with many of our first wave immigrants, and they brought with them the Catholicism from their own country. In the late 60s, the Middle East conflict, Six-Day War, civil strife in Lebanon, also saw Catholics from the Middle East immigrate to Australia, particularly many of you who have a Maronite background. Your grandparents may have come in that period. And also, not surprisingly, because Greece and Macedonia were so badly impacted by the Second World War, we also saw the initial rise of orthodoxy from just under 0.2% to 1.6% over a 15 to 25-year period. Because Greek Orthodox immigrants came from Greece, Macedonian Orthodox immigrants came from Macedonia, and so on. In the 1970s, a little different. Islam appears on the census for the first time. It becomes 0.3% of the population, largely because of conflict in the Middle East, Lebanese civil war, and something that the Whitlam Labor government did as its first action after election in December 1972. It finally abolished the White Australia policy, which had been in decline for about 15 years, but it finally abolished it. That meant that people did not have to look Anglo or sound Anglo to be accepted into Australia. And that was the start of our real diversification. We also had Catholicism in the 70s at its peak, fuelled largely by continued immigration from Lebanon, but also a large number of Vietnamese refugees arriving as a result of the Vietnam War. And many of the Vietnamese refugees that came to Australia were Catholic. Some not, some Buddhist, but many were Catholic. So Catholicism peaks at 27%. You can, nope, that's not what I wanted to do. You can see here, I've added the numbers. We can then go through each of the other decades, and you'll notice I haven't added the numbers. And I don't give the numbers to my own students because I think that you've got to engage with them yourself. You've got to understand them. So you get your printed census document and you get this PowerPoint or your summary, your own grid, and you add the statistics so that you do know some numbers. Largely, there's a decline in Anglicanism, and Catholicism becomes the largest Christian denomination in the 1986 census because there is a decline in immigration from England, but there's also more Catholic migration from the Balkan area after the war there. There's an increase in Islam from Southeast Asia, the Balkans and the Middle East, and we're also starting to see the growth of Buddhism in the 1980s, again fuelled by Southeast Asian migration. So the abolition of the White Australia policy in 1972 provided a huge catalyst for a change in the religious landscape. Landscape, up, down, across, mountains, valleys. Think about it, it's a great metaphor. And then finally the 90s and to 2011 census, or into 2014, what we're noticing is a real diversification of Christianity as immigration from different countries brings different denominations. We're still noticing an increase in Islam, both from Asia, Middle East, and then from countries in Middle Africa, from Ethiopia, from the Sudan. We notice the shift. Immigration is responsible. Interestingly, at the end of the 1990s, I don't know whether you're aware that Hong Kong and Macau were handed back to communist China. They used to be British protectorates. That saw a huge increase in Asian migration to Australia before that happened. And so we saw a combination of Christianity and other Asian religions coming to Australia, a growth in Buddhism particularly. And the other thing that's really interesting about that Asian migration, we talked about the Uniting Church and how Presbyterianism was the only strand that remained independent. You drive around the place and you're actually starting to see Methodist churches appear. And those Methodist churches are being brought by Methodist Chinese from Hong Kong, even from Taiwan. So they've had the experience of Methodism in their home country, they've immigrated to Australia and they've brought that with them. So there's even a smidgy shift there. I don't know that it'll ever make it back onto the census, but it's an interesting trend. And then finally, accounting for Hinduism as the fastest growing religious tradition from 2006 to 2011, migration from India and the Indian subcontinent has been massive in the last 5 years. And if we took the immigration data on the census and we put it next to the religion data, we would actually see that the largest migrant group in that census period is from the Indian subcontinent. And so they have brought with them Hinduism. So that's a large increase. It doesn't mean that Indians haven't brought Catholicism as well. It doesn't mean that they haven't brought other practices. But in general, that explains that large increase in Hinduism. Describe and account for. And the reason it's broken up into time periods, ladies and gentlemen, you can pick immigration from 45 to 2011 if the question is general. But think about it if they ask you in the 20th century, 21st century, between 45 and 81, something like that. And we've just covered immigration. What about some of the other factors? Secularism, New Age, denominational switching. And as I said, my two favourites that don't actually make it onto the syllabus but are so very important, the abolition of white Australia in 72 and the formation of the Uniting Church in 77. Secularism. Just have a look at the cartoon. I quite like it. And yet, do you know that on any given Sunday, there are more Christian Australians in religious worship than there are at football games? Kind of surprised me, actually, because I thought there might have been more at football. But anyway, Australia has always been a reasonably secular country. There's been no compulsion to be religious since maybe there was in the very early days of settlement, but pretty much there's been no compulsion to be religious. There is certainly no compulsion to be religious in our constitution. So by and large, Australia has been a secular society. What do we need to know? Well, we need to know what secularism is. We need to know where is the evidence for increased secularism, because that's the trend. And we need to know what impact that has had on the landscape. Can we look at those census statistics and say, yes, there's a correlation between secularism and something I see there? So, what is secularism? It simply means life without reference to religion. So a secular worldview is a worldview that does not include religion. Think about it. We actually did that at the very beginning of our Year 11 course when we did Nature of Religion. The evidence for increased secularism is interesting. For those of you who've never seen it, I would really advise you logging on to a website called the McCrindle blog. You find it at mccrindle.com.au, mccrindle.com.au, and it has some fabulous infographics, both for 1 and 2 unit students, about the religious landscape in Australia, and also for your religion and non-religion topic. So if we were to look simply at the 2011 census, and we were to say, okay, Australia's a predominantly Christian country, can't be so secular. That would be true. However, all of the other religious traditions together add up to 7.3% of the population. So what's missing? Lots. Okay, 20-something percent, 30-something percent. And if we then have a look at some trend data over the last 4 decades, so approximately the last 40 years, what we find is that Christianity has dropped by 22%, that church attendance in Christian churches has dropped by 48%, and that no religion has risen a staggering 269%. No religion equals secularism. So we probably don't need much more proof than that. But McCrindle are very good to us, and they do some interesting things with their data. They're simply a sociological data collecting company, but they do some really good Australian-based stuff. And this was one of the surveys that they did, and it was about facilities needed in a community. So which new community facility would most meet your needs? This was an Australia-wide survey. And when people were surveyed, they suggested that we might need parklands, free car parking, community centres, youth centres, a food and cafe precinct, absolutely, park with play equipment, a library, a new local shopping village, indoor sporting facility, leash-free dog park, local childcare, an indoor sports facility for all those wet days, and finally, we might need a local church. The numbers in black was the order that was presented on the actual survey. The numbers in blue on the right-hand side of each column indicate what the Australian population said their needs were. So, apparently Australians need parkland with walking tracks. We need cafes. We need leash-free dog parks. We even need youth centres and local childcare centres more than we need our local church. That would not have been the case 50 years ago. This is evidence of increased secularism. And then we had a look at the services. So not actual buildings and physical things, but the services provided to communities. And they were asked to view things like youth groups, employment training, counselling and crisis support, kids clubs and playgroups, seminars for seniors, financial seminars and advice, parenting support seminars, English classes for migrants, relationship seminars, and spiritual input and church services. You'll notice that financial information is very, very much more important than church services. That made it in just above migrant English classes. And try as I might, I haven't been able to find out the actual suburbs where this was done, but I'm wondering whether perhaps it might have been done in a predominantly Anglo area, I don't know. But I do think it's interesting, and for those of you who do the 2-unit course, think about the rise of materialism. This is perfect evidence for your rise of materialism. The second thing that the syllabus asks us to look at is New Age philosophies. The term that the syllabus actually uses is religions. I have a bit of an issue with it because when we go back to our preliminary course, we said that religions have certain characteristics. We said that they have beliefs and believers. We said that they have sacred texts and writings. We said that they have deities or divine powers. It is not necessarily true that the New Age has those things. So I tend to use the term philosophies to describe the New Age. Anything about the New Age that captures the need of an individual. So these philosophies are not necessarily well organised. They don't necessarily have groups of followers. They're very individualistic, fitting in with the cult of the rise of the individual. And they are not necessarily exclusive of religion. I imagine that many of you in the room are at least nominally Catholic. How many of you have looked at your star sign in the last 12 months? Been for a massage, perhaps? had your palm read, maybe looked at some tea leaves, maybe worn a crystal or two. Welcome to the new age. You see, they're not exclusive of religion. They're simply about personal fulfilment. And I would alert the 2-unit students to the fact that this is very different to the new religious expressions that are part of your 2-unit course. They are religious expressions. And I know Miss Kleist is going to talk about those in her presentation today. So we asked the same question for New Age philosophies as we did for secularism. What are they? Where's the evidence? And what impact have they had on the landscape? Well, I would suggest that you are probably evidence of this. Quite like this cartoon, it sums up the New Age beautifully. Can we prove it on the census? This one is harder to prove than secularism, because we can't necessarily say that all people of no religion are the ones who support New Age philosophies, because we have seen that those philosophies can be an adjunct to religious belief. But we can certainly speculate that the rise of individualism has meant a rejection of religious practice by some, hence the increase in the non-religion category. So we can suggest that. But only suggest our modality is important here. It's not as clear-cut as I drop religion and pick up New Age. It's more complex than that. And our final one in this area is denominational switching, which is a little bit like the little man in this cartoon who picks up the lid of the church, checks it out, and wonders if he likes this one or if he'll put the lid back down and go to the next one. Sometimes it's called the revolving door syndrome. Think about a revolving door. You can walk in and walk straight out. You can walk in, hang in the building for a time and come out. It's a very good metaphor. What can we say about it? It is fluid movement between Christian denominations. Fluid movement between Christian denominations. Largely it is a Protestant phenomenon. There is less denominational switching in Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Largely it is a young person's phenomenon. So those under 30 are the greatest number of denominational switches. Reasons cited, personal fulfilment, like the minister, like the community, like the music. However, it's interesting that as rural Australia shrinks, we're actually finding the denominational switching phenomenon happening for very pragmatic reasons in rural communities. A friend of mine is a Protestant who lives in Tasmania. And it's a very big problem down there because the population is so small and the religions are shrinking. In your local community, you might be Baptist and your Baptist church closes, and your Anglican church closes, but your uniting church remains open. So you shift so that you can still attend a Protestant denomination. May not be the Protestant denomination of your choice, but if it's that or drive 200 kilometres to the next town, then maybe you might take that option. So there's a whole lot of reasons for denominational shifting. Again, its impact on the religious landscape, it's harder to say because there is a shift in and a shift out. But if we look at the general rise in Pentecostalism from 0 in about 1976 census up to 2.8 in our 2011 census, then in fact what we find is a substantial amount of evidence for Pentecostalism growing at the expense of other religious traditions, Protestant religious traditions by and large. It doesn't seem to be affecting the Baptist Church to quite the same extent at present, But the National Church Life Survey says that there is a fairly fluid movement and that within their lifetime, most Protestant adherents of Christianity will switch denominations at least twice. Yeah.
Is there also a lack of staying with them, particularly so returning to there's a trial
Absolutely.
of Pentecostalism, but that revolving door?
Yes, the revolve is about 18 months on average. The revolve in and the revolve out is about 18 months. But I guess it's the attraction of it that keeps particularly the young people coming. All right, we're nearly out of time and I would like to cover these. We won't do our multiple, maybe we might do one of our multiple choice because I'd like to talk about this one. These style of multiple choice were introduced to the HSC about 3 years ago. There's usually 2 of them. They're often question 8, 9 or 10 and they're very wordy. But there's a trick. You simply look at the statement first, one at a time. You decide whether the statement is T, 2 or F false, and then you look at the options. So, statement 1, the Anglican Church is the largest Christian denomination in Australia. False, because it's Catholicism. The majority of Presbyterians, Methodists and Baptists merged to form the Uniting Church. False. So the answer is B. You just got 1 mark on the HSC, ladies and gentlemen. Well done. I'll spend a little bit of time on this because ecumenism and interfaith dialogue is something that many students get confused. And this is often an area that our 5-mark response can be written on in this topic. What we are asked to do with this is 2 different things. So not only is ecumenism different from interfaith dialogue, but what the syllabus asks us to do with it are 2 different things. For ecumenism, we are asked to describe the impact. We're actually supposed to say what has changed or what has happened in descriptive terms. And we're supposed to do that with reference to the work of 2 ecumenical organisations. The New South Wales Council of Churches, now called Churches Together New South Wales and ACT, and the the National Council of Churches of Australia. With regard to interfaith, we're asked to evaluate the importance. We are asked to make a value judgment, not on its success or its failure, but why it's important in Australian society. So, what is ecumenism? Ecumenism, Christianity. There's your cue. Ecumenism refers to the movement towards religious unity among Christian denominations. It's about acknowledging that unity in Christ outweighs religious difference. It's about Christ. It is not about combining all denominations into one, and it's not about religious traditions other than Christianity. It is solely about denominations within Christianity. And so the syllabus says to us, okay, National Council of Churches, ecumenism looks a bit like that. We have to describe the impact of it. So, what I've done here is purely and simply said what the New South Wales Ecumenical Council is. As I said, now called Churches Together New South Wales and ACT. It has 16 member Protestant churches. And you can see, using Ephesians chapter 4, its mission is about maintaining the unity of the Spirit and the bonds of peace, and it's about being committed to the gospel. Gospel equals Jesus. This is a Christian phenomenon. What do? They do lots of things, heaps and heaps and heaps of things. But one thing that they do is they have a Peace and Justice Commission, which works to enhance outcome for asylum seekers. To improve peacemaking, they have an International Day of Peace, a prayer on the International Day of Peace on the 21st of September every year. It's organised by New South Wales Ecumenical Council. They also are involved in an initiative called the House of Welcome, which welcomes asylum seekers. So the justice arm of the Peace and Justice Commission makes a difference in provision of services and advocacy for asylum seekers. It makes a difference. They also had a conference last year, a forum on peace with justice. The flyer is actually still on their website. If you're a 2-unit student, it's worthwhile knowing about because it's a great example for Christianity and peace. The NCCA, formed after the New South Wales Ecumenical Council in 1994, has 19 member churches. One of them is the Catholic Church. Catholic Church is not a member of the New South Wales Ecumenical Council, but it does work in partnership with the state body. So it's the peak body for ecumenical activity in Australia. And this slide, which you won't be able to read, but I put it up because you need to go to the NCCA website if you haven't seen it. This summarises everything they do. So this is just a slide off their page. And what we find here is really important initiatives like this one. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Ecumenical Commission, in which Christian religious denominations work together, they lobby governments, they make all sorts of statements in defence of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. They were very, very vocal earlier this year when the Abbott government wanted to close remote communities in Western Australia. They were also very, very vocal in the action in the Northern Territory. They're also involved in environmental things. And last year there was a day on World Environment Day 2014, Raise Your Voice and Not the Sea Level. And it was a ecumenical gathering to look at ways that Australians can advocate for climate change. If you do Christianity and environmental ethics, there's a really good example. And I've already spoken about NatSec. Interfaith dialogue, on the other hand, is different. Interfaith dialogue is about developing greater mutual understanding between different religious traditions. Between traditions. It is not about faith, it is not about unity, it is not about making religions the same. It's about meeting people where they are at, sometimes combining for the common good, and educating to dispel fear and prejudice. That's what interfaith dialogue is about. If you have never been to the Uniting Church of Australia Interfaith Dialogue site, Uniting Justice, it's part of that. It's called Relations with Other Faiths. The Uniting Church, I think, have this absolutely sewn up. Them as a Christian denomination working with Jews, with Muslims and so on. It's a fabulous website. Find yourself an example from it. If we're looking at evaluating success, then we're barking up the wrong tree. We're looking at evaluating the importance. Education is of primary importance. Last year, the New South Wales Council for Christians and Jews ran a forum run by an American Jewish professor of Christian studies. And they invited Christians and Jews to come to Emmanuel Synagogue at Wallara and hear Dr. Amy Jill Levine speak on Jesus, the misunderstood Jew. It was a fabulous night. It was challenging for the Jewish members there. It was challenging for the Christian members there to hear this academic, well-qualified Jewish woman speaking about Jesus, the misunderstood Jew. Very educative and very much about building bridges. And there are many, many other organisations that do that. And I think if you look at the role of Affinity Intercultural in some of the work that they do, they're an Islamic organisation in Australia. They're very good for peace, again, if you do the tuna course. But the work they've done in education, particularly in response to the terrible prejudice experienced by women following September 11 and even again last year following the ISIS strikes in Syria. Muslim women are a target in our society simply by the way they look. And organisations like Affinity work to educate young people like you so that that discrimination doesn't happen. Okay, we've gone over time, so I'm not going to deal with reconciliation. The end is nigh. We are there yet. I know there is some stress, but what you need to do is keep calm and study SOR. Thanks for listening.